All right.
Hey, Nikki.
Hello. Hey, Michelle. How you doing?
Oh, I'm all right. I'm actually really excited to talk about this today. What we're gonna be discussing HRV, nervous system regulation, health, and why it matters for endurance athletes who want to perform. So I want to start with a little story, and it has to do with when this was years ago, probably might have been like 2019, 2020, right? It's during COVID time, I think, but so I started hearing about HRV. What is HRV? I didn't know what it was, but there were some like new AI training programs that were being released that as a coach I just found really interesting, right? Like I'm like, I want to know all the latest everything, where's their value to it and all that. And so I thought it sounded really shiny, right? So here's like an AI generated training plan that you could like download or as an app, and it would get to know you over time, and every day it would tell you what type of training you should be doing based on all these different factors, right? Like a lot of factors, like what was your state that day, what are your goals, what time do you have available, all these things. And so that's when I really started measuring HRV for the first time, and I didn't totally know what I was measuring, but I was giving this number to this computer program, and then the computer program would be like, oh, okay, well, based on this, here's what you should be doing today. Well, at the time, I was not in a good state, sort of, I would say, mentally, physically, and there were a lot of factors that led into that, including my own denial, right? Like, this is me wanting to train, me wanting to push through, me thinking that I was being tough by pushing through instead of letting myself rest. I genuinely didn't want to rest. I'm addicted to big, hard training, and more is more. So, anyway, what was happening is I was measuring my HRV and giving it to this program, and every day the program was like, "You should rest."
Oh,
Like, I didn't want to, I'm like, I don't want to rest, and so my gut instinct was always like, well, just ignore what that program said because it's not what I want to do. And by the way, I would say that I felt fine, right? Like I felt fine. I was able to get through the workouts, and so I'm thinking, I don't know if this thing knows what it's talking about. But there was one day that like I measured HRV. It showed up as yellow or red, like on the thing. The program told me to rest. I didn't want to rest. And so I jumped onto Zwift into like a group workout that was happening with a group that I knew and I wanted to participate in. And it wasn't like a crazy hard workout. It was like a sweet spot workout. It shouldn't have been like crazy hard. But I got on, and immediately warming up, my heart rate was way high. I mean, it was like in the ways as I'm pushing 100 watts, like spinning and trying to, and I'm thinking that solidly 10 to 15 beats higher than it should have been. And then I started the workout, and it just felt like really, really bad. And that was my first, I don't know, we'll call it like an indication or a level of acceptance that this HRV
mhm,
number I was seeing had some validity, even if I didn't like it. And I
mhm.
feel like that's the thing. Like there's times, and I've been coaching for 16 years now, and we've seen that, or what I've seen, I'd be curious to see if it's what you've seen, is that the athletes that are most opposed to measuring heart rate or like recording heart rate when they're training are athletes who don't like what that number is telling them, right? I don't like what it's telling me, so therefore I'm just not going to record it. And so when my early experience with measuring HRV, I didn't know enough to take the low readings as seriously as I should have. And what I ultimately ended up doing was learning how to manipulate it so that I could get a higher reading, right? So, like, I would take a reading and it would be low. And I would be like, well, I can't feed that to the algorithm. Like, I have to give it a higher number so that it'll give me some real training today because I definitely want and need real training. And so I would do different things. I would measure it again in a different position. I would get up. I found out if you drink some cold water and then you take the HRV again, it'll go up. If you do a little breathing session and then take it again, it'll go up. Like, I mean, I was doing all the things, and I would just keep taking it until I got a high number or higher or a high enough number that the algorithm would let me train that day. And I'm thinking, and I did that for a while, like just totally lying to myself because I wanted to train. And then finally, it was that experience of that bad bike ride where I thought, maybe there's something to this and I should look into it more.
Mhm.
And what I was, because in a big picture, like now hindsight's 2020, right? So like I can go back and look, like I was not benefiting from the training I was doing during that period
Hmm.
because my body wasn't ready to absorb the work. So my body was ready to do the work. Most of the time I could do it, but I wasn't benefiting from it because I wasn't absorbing it. The HRV measurement was coming at a pretty good time, really, even though like I didn't like it.
Hmm.
And when I finally accepted it and was like, okay, I need to figure out. But the thing is, like, what I was doing was trying to figure out how to make my HRV number higher.
Right.
But what I really needed to do, so like now, like 5 years later, looking back, what I really needed to do was improve my nervous system health, like my nervous system
Hmm.
regulation, my nervous system health, because what that low HRV was telling me was that I was dysregulated. Like my nervous
Hmm.
system was not regulated. And then when you look at the other physiological signs that your body's not regulated, it was like, yeah, I had all those too, right?
Right.
Like the excessive sweating and the not sleeping
Hmm.
and the feeling like I'm guarded and braced and, protecting myself all the time, somewhat reactive to like a
Hmm.
small thing, a major sense of urgency that like we have to get this done. Like everything
Hmm.
was of utmost importance, like even the small things, like I was sweating over the small things. And so it's like those things, when I look back now, knowing what I know now, it was so obvious. But at the time, because I didn't know as much, I wasn't helping myself
Right.
the way that I could have been. Anyway, and so that's what I really want to talk about today, like in this whole podcast, is about like it's really about nervous system regulation so that we can be in a healthy state, so that when we train, we can benefit from the training. And how does HRV as a measurement tool help us understand
Right.
that?
Right.
Right.
I
So
mean,
anyway,
yeah, and I think you mentioned this, but well, your training, you could still do the training, right? Like, and you are manipulating the HRV measurement to allow you to feel good. Some of the, not all the training, maybe you did have group ride that did not go well, but was it the fact that you could still do the training, but you weren't getting better, right? Like you weren't progressing because your body wasn't in a state that you could recover from the training. Is that
mhm.
kind of
Yeah.
what
Yeah. So
you
I was like
experienced?
in a
I
hole
was
and I was just
right.
digging.
You're just digging. And I see this a lot with athletes that they're like, well, I don't understand why I'm not getting faster, right? I don't understand why I'm not getting stronger, more power. I do the training, but it's like, and I can point out like my gut feeling is you're not adapting, right? You're not recovering. Your body's not able to absorb that. And most of the athletes that are in this state, honestly, well, some of them are measuring HRV with like Aura Ring. Many of them are not. They just choose not to. They don't want to look at it, and so their go-to is, I just want more training. I want more training and harder training because it has to work out. When you're in your 20s and 30s, maybe or younger, and I don't want to make this an age-specific thing because you can have health underlying nervous system issues at any age. However, I do think that it compounds when we get older because age makes it harder to adapt to things anyways, right? So then you're compounding a nervous system dysregulation issue on top of the aging athlete, the masters athlete. And that's where I see, and I work with a lot of these athletes that, they're just in a state of, I don't understand. I don't understand. The other thing I was going to say is, so HRV, like Michelle, just said, is a tool, but you can also understand these concepts without measuring HRV. So it's sort of like, it's telling you something, but it's really something you probably already know about it, right? About what's going on in your body. Just my 2 cents. Maybe not everyone, because not everyone has that awareness.
Yeah, so and I'm glad you used that word awareness because I took some notes
It's
before,
true. Yeah.
to organize my mind, and I'm thinking really like the key thing here is the awareness and not living in a state of denial, right? And so I feel like I mean, I'm sure you have athletes too. Like I have empathy for athletes who are living in a state of denial because I did that for a really long time, right? So like there's no judgment coming from me if you're one of those athletes that's living in a state of denial. Like I did that for a really long time. And by the way, it worked for me for a long time. Like it works until it doesn't. You can do the no pain, no gain for potentially quite a long time, like years, until it doesn't work anymore. And then at some point, your body's going to come back and tell you. One thing that measuring, like when I finally started to bring the awareness in, and it wasn't like I wasn't aware, like I was aware that I had an excessive sweat rate, but I was like, that's just
natural,
It's just
normal
who I
for you.
am,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Like that's just how I am. Like I've always been like that. Right? I mean, I live in Hawaii. Of course, I'm sweating a lot. Like it's super humid here, right? But like when your hands and feet are sweating at random times, like I mean, I'm on a massage table
Right.
in the my feet are sweating. You know what I mean? You're like, there's something systemic that is going on with your body here, and your body is trying to tell you that. And I think a really key message, a take home message from this whole discussion we're having today that I want people to keep in mind is that we are really, really good at lying to ourselves and living in denial, like because our brains will make up stories to justify, rationalize all day long. But what doesn't lie is our body's physiology, right? So my
Absolutely.
brain can lie to me, but my body's not lying. And that is why measuring or like really, so even so it's either measuring HRV and then knowing what that is and what it means and what you can do about it. Measuring heart rate, what does it mean? What can you do about it? Measuring how much you're sleeping overnight, and then taking steps to help yourself there. That, or even if you're not measuring it, just being aware. Like I can feel when my heart starts beating. I can feel when I have excess muscle tension, right? I can feel like I'm aware of when I snapped and flew off the handle and yelled at somebody that I shouldn't have. And those things are all very real signals from our bodies that our brains will rationalize all day. But when you can get those two to be on the same page and to take those really seriously, that's when your, I will say, like, I don't know, I hate the word journey, but like this is like journey to a better, healthier state will happen. And like I remember even years ago, before I knew any of this, a pattern that I saw with athletes that I coached was that the healthiest ones were the ones that recovered better and were able to train more, right? So you take an unhealthy athlete who, like, at baseline, nervous system health is not good, and you give them a moderately hard workout, shouldn't, not even crazy hard, just like moderately hard, and it puts them in the gutter for 2 days. You're like, like you should
That's
have,
not,
that one wasn't supposed to be that hard.
yeah.
You should have recovered from that. And so when you're not recovering, it really is a sign that there's a baseline health thing going on, that until you address that, no
Yep.
training will ever work.
Right. Absolutely. I also have seen these same athletes, recurrent sickness. I mean, little bugs, big bugs. I mean, sometimes it is a product of where they work. Certainly I've worked with teachers and teachers of young children. And yeah, I mean, they're sick a lot because young children are sick a lot. However, there's other athletes that, I mean, every single Ironman build, I mean, they're sick, and I'm very conservative in their training. And it's like, there's something underlying, right? There's a health, a health issue. So it doesn't, there's other like not making progress in training, constant sickness, like Michelle said, like sweating, feeling tightness, I will also say little injuries, right? Like constant, like maybe not big injuries, but little, tweaks here and there, right? Your Achilles just constantly kind of inflamed, or um, so all these things, it's not just random. Like we want to, and yeah, athletes do. Well, I just kind of overdid that, or I, I mean, we make up stories of why that's happening, and the reality is like no, there's an underlying, health, baseline health issue that is not super fun to solve either. Uh,
No.
Sometimes.
And it takes a long time. It's
Hmm.
not like, I mean, it's interesting. I was watching like that. I like watching the videos that the professionals make on
Oh yeah,
YouTube or whatever, when I'm riding my bike and my trainer. And just the other day, like Sam Long posted some video, and in the middle of it, he did an ad for Athletic Greens, right? And so he's drinking this Athletic Greens, and like, look, I'm not saying don't drink Athletic Greens. It may help you some, but the way that he's drinking it and the way that he's framing it was like, well, this is what everybody's doing, and it's really important to be healthy. And so, like, I'm just going to make sure that I'm topped off on all my micronutrients and make sure that I'm healthy so that I can absorb my
right.
training and get better from it. And like the message is true, yes. And my God, if it was just as easy as drinking Athletic Greens every day,
Yeah,
and you would solve your nervous system dysfunction, like that would be great, right? But for a lot of us, it goes so far beyond that. Like it's not just, there's the, like what you hit on there of like solving the underlying health issue it can feel like such a big, daunting project to undertake. And it takes so long to actually do that it can almost feel like, I remember thinking that, like when I remember reading about nervous system things, like when I was trying to diagnose my own problems like years ago, those articles would always just talk about like just go outside and be in sunshine and put your feet on the
Right.
ground and go for a walk, and and it could take months, so just relax and be patient. And I'm like in my impatient state, like, no, just give me the athletic greens, I just want to drink the thing and then be healthy. And like that mindset in and of itself is a sign that you're in like a nervous system dysregulated state. When you're like, hurry up and give me the answer. I just want the one thing that I can do today so that tomorrow I'm back to full health. Like that mindset in and of itself is not the one that is going to help you. And the
If anything,
idea of letting go is like the
yeah.
scariest thing in the world.
Absolutely. If anything, that mindset is what is helping to create the unhealthy underlying system, right? That fight or flight constantly and needing that immediate result. And a lot, I mean, it's so prevalent everywhere. I think everyone gets tied up in it at some point, at some level, whether it be sport or career or impatience and waiting in a grocery line, right? Like, oh, this cashier's taking too, I mean, it's the mindset of just reactivity, right? And that influences the central nervous system, right? The autonomic, is that the right? Yeah. Yeah.
And this seems like that was a good bridge into like, what are we even talking about when we talk about nervous system, like a nervous system regulation? And so our autonomic nervous system, if you think about like two major branches of it, and I like to think of it as a window, right? Where on the high side, you have this sympathetic nervous system, and that would be like your fight or flight. I'm reacting to emergencies, ready to perform. Like what we don't want to do here is paint that the sympathetic nervous system is something that we never want to, we don't ever want to be in that state. We definitely sometimes want to be in that state. We definitely want access to that state. It is helpful for survival. And in some cases, mandatory for survival. And then on the other end of that, so the fight or flight at the top end of this sort of, we'll call it like a stress window. On the bottom end be your parasympathetic nervous system state. Sometimes when I'm writing that out, I just put PNS for parasympathetic nervous system. And what that is like, that's your rest and digest, right? So like, that's where your body is in a state. So this isn't really, I mean, while it's reflected in your brain state and what you're thinking, what we're talking about here are the physiological signs that you're in a sympathetic nervous system state or a parasympathetic nervous system state. Your body does its rest and digest and recover and repairs and all of that in the parasympathetic nervous system state. That a lot of that can and should be happening also while you're sleeping overnight. And if we
Mhm.
think about sleep as a surrender, like we want to feel safe so that we can just surrender into this state of repair, which is what sleep is every night. When we're caught up in living in this sympathetic nervous system state because we don't take efforts, or I don't know, we don't
Right.
take steps to bring ourselves down out of it. Like our society largely, the way that it comes at us every day with all the things, like there's so
Yeah.
many things that can cause a stress response. And so when our systems are bombarded with that all the time, we're living in the sympathetic nervous system state. We're on edge all the time. We're guarding, we're bracing, we're protecting ourselves for impact. And when we think about this in sort of evolutionary terms, it really helps us understand, like, is that a parasympathetic nervous system state thing, or is it more of like a rest and recovery? And the way to really think about that is like, does your body feel safe? And that doesn't mean necessarily does your mind feel safe, but does your body feel safe? And so your body needs to feel safe in order to go into that rest and digest mode. And when it doesn't feel safe, you're going to guard, embrace, and protect. And then there's a lot of things that come out of that that keep you in that state. One of them is breathing, which I talk about all the time, right? So if somebody were to scare you, right? Like, let's say that, like, I don't know, like somebody just broke into my house. The first thing I would do is, I mean, just my whole body would
Mhm.
go on edge, right? Like I would tighten up. my breath would start to get short and tight, my pupils would dilate, my hair might stand up. I would just be on high alert here. That would be necessary to be preparing myself to battle like whatever threat is currently threatening me. So it's very real and important to have that ability.
Hmm.
So you don't also, it's pretty rare to get stuck in parasympathetic nervous system state, but it is possible. Like your people who are just super depressed and don't give a shit about anything and aren't going to get out of bed and, like whatever, I could care less. Right. Like that's a dysregulation on the low side versus
Hmm.
most of us are dysregulated on the high side, but it is possible. And I want to point that out. A healthy system is able to easily bounce back and forth between the two. And I think that a key to getting there is understanding that we have these like upper and lower sort of threshold limits, and then being aware of when I'm upregulated, and then also understanding like tools and strategies and techniques that I can use to bring myself down. And if I ever find that I'm just like too down for too long, having strategies that I can bring myself up. Like I want to get excited about something. I want to go out and perform. And the healthiest systems are ones that are easily able to bounce back and forth between those two states. And so like what we don't want to do is to get stuck in one. And the way to not get stuck in one is to be aware that it's possible to get stuck in one. And then ask
Hmm.
yourself some really tough questions and be the phrase that I used with myself to help get myself out of that state more permanently was this idea of being radically honest with myself. And when I decided to be radically honest with myself, that's when I was like, okay, even when I'm getting signs from my body that I don't like, I'm going to listen to those signs instead of ignoring them, even when I don't want to, and that's hard to do. And I'm going to listen to these communications from my body, and I'm going to enter into a partnership with my body where my brain and body are working together instead of separately from each other, right? And I've had athletes tell me this too, where like I dominate my body, like my brain dominates my body. Okay, and so listen, there may be a time that that's appropriate. You're running a marathon in the last 10K of that marathon. Yeah, like to have a brain that is able to dominate your body and, like shut down some of those signals where your body's screaming at you to stop. Like that in that moment is a potentially a thing that allows you to win a race, right? I'm able to dominate my body. When you're outside of a particular situation like that, it's way better to be in partnership with your body, listening to the signals that you're getting so that your body can continue to be healthy and later perform at its peak
Hmm.
ability. Right. And so the radical honesty part,
I
listening
like that.
to the
Yeah.
body is a really important thing, and not thinking all the time that I'm dominating my body, and knowing
I,
the time and place of like when that's an okay thing to
mhm.
do. And I would say the only time that that's really an okay thing to do is when you're actually in a state of physical threat, or like at the end of a race, which is kind of the same thing to your
Right.
body, right? And the
Right.
rest of the time, actually listening to your body is the better path.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. I like the radical honesty. Often use radical acceptance with athletes, and myself, of accepting the situation, the training build, the fact that you got sick, whatever it might be. We've talked before about how honesty and acceptance is the pathway to freedom, right? Because that's reality. And everything else we're just making up in our mind. It's fantasy and things we want, things we did wrong, things that maybe we did right, right? But it's not relevant to what we're doing on the day, that session or that race or whatever it may be. So I like that radical honesty.
Yeah. So
Um,
speaking of you want to
no, go ahead.
go?
No, go ahead.
So speaking of that radical honesty, what it means sometimes goes back to that story I was telling you in the beginning about how like I wanted to be training hard more often, and so I was ignoring these signs from my body saying that you're not benefiting from this, and I wanted to believe that I was, and so I was pushing through a lot. But what you want to do when you start getting signs from your body that you're not in a state that you're ready to absorb and recover from training is to let yourself train legitimately easy. And what that might mean
Hmm.
is just going for a walk and avoiding the temptation to run, or like spinning on your bike at 80 watts kind of thing.
Hmm.
Just all you're doing is moving some blood around and stimulating your body in a really easy, low aerobic way. Easy movement. Yoga, flow roping actually
Hmm.
can do an amazing job of the same kind of thing, of like this really easy movement for your body can really help your nervous system calm itself down. And it really makes sense. So if it feels to you, if you're listening to this and you're like, I don't totally understand what they're talking about, if you want to think about big picture things and you want to know, is this something that's going to calm my nervous system, or is it something that's going to, upregulate my nervous system? Then think in terms of like, is this something that I would do if I was completely safe and had no worries in the world? Like, is that how I would be acting? And like, by the way, if I genuinely was, if I'm being chased by a tiger and I'm genuinely not safe, I'm not going to be moving in a slow, relaxed way with breathing that's low and slow. I'm going to be sprinting. Like, I'm going to be working really hard. So you can think of, your hard training, your body doesn't know if you're training or if you're running from a lion, right? But like when I'm doing efforts that are above threshold, that is a sympathetic nervous system stimulus. And my body's going to have to recover from that at some point. And so if you're looking to be like, what do I need to do to regulate my nervous system or down regulate my nervous system? It's literally anything at all that puts your body and mental state into a state of like, I'm completely safe. And if it falls into that category, that like this is something you would do if you felt completely safe, then you're likely helping downregulate yourself,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. Yeah. Uh, Question consideration. I'm not sure I have. So there's correlation, I would say. I don't know if there's statistical data because it's really hard. I'm trying to think of like how you'd run these lab experiments between parasympathetic and s- uh, parasympathetic and the what's the sympathetic. Right, sympathetic. I don't know why I just blanked on those two, but those two states often will correlate to a higher HRV, right? And so when you are in, right, having
When you're in a sympathetic nervous system dominated state, your HRV is going to be lower.
when you're in a
Like
yes,
when
right,
you're in
right,
a fight
right.
or flight, like then HRV is going to be lower. And when you're in like a I'm safe, rest and digest. And by the way, so like this makes a lot of sense because we haven't even defined yet what is HRV. What are we even talking about? Like we're taking for granted that people know what HRV is. HRV, heart rate variability. And what we're looking at, or the way that it's measured, it's different from heart rate. Heart rate is how many times per minute is your heart
Hmm.
beating. Heart rate variability is we're looking specifically at the time between beats. And a healthy, regulated, relaxed, safe system will have heartbeats that have a high degree of variability, meaning sometimes there's more space between heartbeats, sometimes there's less, but we're
Hmm.
measuring this like it's really, really, how do you say? It's intricate. Like it's a challenging measure. It's a small measure that we're talking about, but it makes sense then that the higher your heart is beating, the faster it's beating, obviously, then the less space there is for like any space between beats. So when you are working out and your heart rate's above like 120, if your heart rate's 120, it means your heart is beating 2 times every second. That doesn't leave a lot of room for variability between beats. But when you're resting and you're sleeping and your heart rate is like 50 or 60, then that leaves a lot more space in between beats for there to be more variability. And in a healthy system, we want more
Right.
variability. In a system that is working hard or is on edge, it's just going to be very, what's the word, like repetitive. It's like this repetitive motion where I'm just going to save as much energy as I can doing the exact same thing every time because I do not have any space or availability for like using excess energy on
Right.
switching it up, right?
Right.
So more variability is better and that happens more parasympathetic state. If you ever take your HRV immediately after a hard workout, which I've done like a lot, just when I was learning, like I wanted to understand, immediately after a hard workout, your HRV will be very low. which makes sense, right? Because your body's still in this sympathetic state, then you can test out like an hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later. And I don't know how valid it actually is though, because there's so many
Yeah,
things that like, play into
affected.
it. There's tons of things. But if you're measuring that and and you're calm and relaxed and the state is like just, I don't know, reasonably stable, you can see that 3 hours later, are you recovered from that session? Like, is your HRV back up to normal, or is it still in the gutter? And if it's still in the gutter, then your body's not recovered from that session. And if the next morning it's still in the gutter from that hard session, then it's like that's how your body is not recovering.
Right. So I think I jumped ahead. I think what I was trying to get at is this is a good clarification for people. So when you are measuring this, I mean, you can measure it after workout, like Michelle said, to get an idea of that braggy brew. But what I was trying to get at is if you have a person that has the ability to jump up to their sympathetic system, right? Like they have that activation energy. I love activation energy, but then they can also downregulate very quickly. Overall, their HRV will be higher. And in some of these apps, you can actually you can track your HRV in comparison to the population of your same age range and gender, and there are slight differences. Overall, as we get older, our HRV, our variability decreases. So I think yeah, sorry, that's kind of where I was going. Like if you are well regulated and you can adapt, right? And you can bring yourself back down after a hard session and you activate yourself to do that hard session, and then recover from it, then you're in a good place and your HRV should be in sort of a normal to maybe even higher range. I mean, there's ranges of HRV. And that's where I think the lab testing, like I don't know, there probably are studies, but I think it's harder maybe to gauge how well someone's nervous system is regulated, right? Like it's because a lot of it's subjective in terms of where they are at activated and then recovering. That's sort of that was my thought process there of like tying it back to HRV for the listeners in terms of like, if you think you're having some sympathetic and parasympathetic, some central nervous system, autonomic systems, autonomic, I don't know why I'm struggling with that word. I actually I want to say autonomous because I've been on this other sciencey thing. We're talking about autonomous UAVs. Anyways, then these are some of the things that you may want to measure, right? Like measuring HRV may give you an indication of some dysregulation that maybe you're already feeling in your body. That's kind of where I was going with that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and watching the trends over time is really interesting too. And so if you're measuring HRV and doing it in a way or like with an app that has like a graph, and most of them would have this, but you're watching sort of the trend lines of your HRV over time, there are some really interesting. I mean, the idea is here, look, be an N equals one, meaning like you're just test this out for yourself because it does vary from human to human. And like some people just naturally have a higher HRV than others. There's some genetic influence there. There's a lot of things that influence it. It's age, it's your sex, it's your genetics. And
Blood
so,
pressure.
yeah. But I
Yeah.
think, yeah, yeah. So understanding your trends over time, like the benefit to measuring HRV, if you are willing to allow lifestyle interventions, meaning the choices that you make during the day to improve your HRV over time, then you will find that when you start living your life in a different way, your HRV will just gently start trending up. And what's interesting is when I was learning about all this too, and I was reading other people's experiences and whatnot, and and what you would see in here, which I found really interesting, and all of it makes a ton of sense. And again, this we're talking N equals one here, but it does make a lot of sense. When you're in a life situation where you're just living with a lot of stress, and so take like a PhD student, right? Like, so when you're like in that phase of your life where you're a PhD student and you're trying to, you're researching your thesis and you're doing whatever you're doing, then you have to go and present it and you have to write your paper and do all the things. And there's a lot of stress and pressure it just is natural that comes with that process. And so and then there'll be a lot of other little things that will contribute, but what you see is that is a period of low HRV that may last for
Mhm.
months because you're in this higher stress state. You may be sleeping less because you're staying up and you're working, or you're just feeling this excess stress. And then as soon as you submit your paper,
Hmm.
and like it's done, check the box, and now like you're free, like almost immediately you may see like a jump in HRV and then a sustained level where it's just higher now because you're
Hmm.
not living under that stress. And then it's like apply that same logic to lots of different situations. Like you have a boss who's just like an authoritarian asshole who is on you all the time and you can never do anything right and you're trying so hard to get the thing right to get some praise from your boss, but your boss is an asshole and just is never going to give it to you. And so every day you go to work and you're living on edge and it's a low level stress, but it's the kind that is that stuff that affects your nervous system. So, like, if you and your spouse or partner aren't getting along that well, and there's just constant tension between you for pick a reason, there's lots of reasons why that happens. Like that, living in those situations, and or you have a coach. I mean, like this has happened to. We've heard it with professional athletes who,
Hmm.
they have a coach that's really hard on them, it's pushing them really hard,
Yeah.
and they don't feel really good about it. And then, literally, the day they leave that coach, HRV skyrockets. Right. And now they're back in this state of like, hey, I feel safe again. Like, and from that state, like sometimes it is that simple of like just figuring out what is the the big umbrella stressor in your life. It could be city living, like it's the noise and the stress and the ambulances and the fire, alarms and the all the things. You're just like I'm just constantly in a state of trying to protect my own life versus I live out in the country where like I hear birds and I've got nature at my backyard. Like
Hmm.
that is going to affect your entire nervous system, and from that state, like when your whole system is healthier, then you will respond to training. And that's why we keep talking about this on this, like, this is a training performance podcast, and we harp on nervous system health because if you want to be responding positively to the training that you're doing so that you can perform better, you need to be in a healthy nervous system state. And then it's like identifying for yourself what are the triggers that are keeping you in a state of
Hmm.
excess stress. And by the way, this is where the radical honesty piece has to come back. There are times where I'm listening. I no, not there are times I'm always listening to my athletes, but athletes that are telling me all these things, right? Of like this got in the way and I couldn't train today because of this, and like all the things in their life. And so I'm witnessing this level of stress that they're experiencing, and then I'm trying to give them easier workouts because that's the appropriate thing to do when you're in a high stress state otherwise. And then they want to train harder. And I've had them ask, like, I want harder workouts. And I'm like, I think you need to address this level of life stress first. And boy, do some of them not like that.
Oh yeah, no, it's
I'm
not
not
popular.
stressed. Michelle, I'm not stressed. I'm not stressed. I feel fine. And I'm like thinking, you've been living with this state of stress for so long that you don't even know what it's like to not be living there. And the reason I know that is because I did it too. Right. And so there's a level of like tension that we can even hold in our fascia, that we're holding it for so long that we don't even know what it's like to like let go and have that tissue actually relax. And then once you experience it, then you're like, oh. And so what I would challenge listeners to do is to like take our words seriously, be radically honest with yourself, journal these things out if you have to, take as much time as you need to, figure out how to, at least for a temporary bit, give your body a sense of true relaxation. That might only happen when you go on vacation, right? Like, I mean, I've had athletes that are like having all these digestive issues at home, right? And like, I'm not digesting any food, and I've got this cycle between like diarrhea and constipation, and I don't know, my stomach just feels bloated. It feels really bad, and this is a digestive system thing, which is like you're not in a rest and digest state. You're living in this state of high stress. No, Michelle, I'm not stressed out. Okay. And then they go on vacation and they're able to eat anything. Like
Yeah.
all the stomach issues disappear. You're like, do you think that there's a connection there between like something in your home environment, right? And I don't know what it is. Like that's for you to figure out.
Right.
And then you went on vacation and now like life is stress free. And now all of a sudden you can digest all sorts of things and there's no
Mhm.
issue. Like that is telling. And
Yeah.
so once you experience that state of like, I'm relaxed, my body's functioning well, it's like pay attention to that. And and try to like normalize it as much as possible, because when you're pulled out of it back into your state of stress, you can recognize it in a way that you might not have recognized it earlier. And a fun story that like I remember when I was first going through that process for myself, it was during COVID, which was a great time to do it because we weren't traveling much. There wasn't
Hmm.
a lot of traffic outside. Like just like life was slower and easier. There were a
Hmm.
lot of online classes that like taught me how to breathe. Like that's really where I
Hmm.
started, was like learning how to breathe low and slow, easy movement stuff to like let my body relax. And I started to sense that state. I'm like, I really like that state. Like this state of relaxation is really, really nice. And oh, by the way, then when I go to train hard from that state, like it actually feels like I'm doing myself a favor instead of digging a hole. And so I'm thinking, oh, I think I'm onto something here. Like this is cool. And then I like when life started to go back to normal, like everything sort of resumes back again. I remember specifically one day where I had to do some driving in town, and like I live in a small town, but and so when I say town, I mean like Honolulu, Waikiki, where there's 5 lanes and big tall buildings and 5 lanes of traffic and cars everywhere, and I don't expose myself to that a lot. And there was a day that I did, and I mean, I was just like my shoulders are up in my ears, and like I'm not breathing well. And like I got home and it was then that I was able to recognize, because I could feel the state of tension because it was different than this easy living that I had been doing. And I'm like, this is it, right? So like now I'm wired. My nervous system
Hmm.
is up on edge. And then I'm able to use the tools and strategies and techniques that I had learned to bring myself down. And like, what are those? So for me, I mean, I'd be curious to hear like what you've learned. For me, for sure, it's just laying on my living room floor, breathing low and slow, moving my body in really, really easy ways, being outside in nature. An interesting one that I think a lot of people don't think about, and this makes a lot of sense, is your eye movements. And so, because imagine again, if we go back to like in a big picture way, when you are under threat and you're not safe, what you're going to do is put on like laser focus, right? I'm
Blinders.
going
Yeah.
to laser focus on this thing because that's the quickest way. And so, by the way, if you're in a race and you're trying to get to the finish line as fast as possible, then a laser focus on the finish line is your way. Even as I say this laser focus, don't think I'm saying laser focus is bad. It's not. It's just take it in context. Like, what's the context of this? So, if I'm laser focused on the finish line of a race, that's a positive thing because I want to be in that state. But if I'm laser focused on my computer screen and I'm reading all day long, I mean, it could be crappy
Hmm.
news. It could be your stuff you're working on for work, or like any of the things where you're like laser focused on this computer screen. That is just the laser focus in and of itself is putting your whole system into that sympathetic nervous system state. And so how do you get out of that? Well, what's the opposite of that? What if I go outside, I use my peripheral vision, I'm going to go soft eyes, relax my eyes, relax my vision, I'm going to look around, look at the horizon, look at the mountains. Like I remember the first time just hearing to go do that sounded so hokey to me. It's like, come on. Like but when you think about it, like, well, that's going to send a system to your nervous, like, or a signal to your nervous system that like, I'm safe, everything's fine, because that's not what you would be doing if you were truly under threat. You wouldn't just be standing there taking in the view of your horizon,
Yeah.
right? So like
Yeah.
watching the sunset is legitimately calming
Hmm.
because it's because of the eye movement thing, and it's a primal signal to your subconscious nervous system. And you're like, okay, so there's ways we can hack into this. You don't have to live in that state when there are tools that you can do to like bring yourself down. So I don't know, do you have tools and tricks and tips that you use personally?
Yeah. I mean, so, well, let me just say, so I'm not going to say that I'm any kind of guru at this, but I didn't, well, yes. So let me just, I'll cover what I've been doing for a long time, even before I started learning about HRV. And I've probably been on a similar path. Like I think I started tracking I don't know, I was maybe late 30s, like 38, 39. So that would be it was a little bit before COVID. It was like 2018, 2019. I had some apps on my phone that used the measure, or maybe it used the heart rate. I can't remember. Anyways, meditation practice. I mean, I've been meditating 20 minutes to 40 minutes every day, almost every day for since 2015. So whatever, 10 years. I have been a not consistent yogi, right? Like I started doing yoga in college and it's been not super consistent, but through that experience and the Eastern philosophy around like, meditation and easy yoga. It wasn't just, I mean, I did all styles of yoga. When I lived in Hawaii, I did a lot of Ashtanga, but then when I moved to back up Manoa Valley, they had a really great yin yoga studio. So yeah, so I kind of had some understanding, right, of like nervous system and down regulation. What else do I do? I mean, yes, nature is huge. And again, being a geologist, like I don't know if geology or and spending time in the field taught me to do these things, like looking around and being really aware of your surroundings and taking it all in. My ex-husband told me I was the spotter, which means that like I have an ability to recognize anomalies in the environment or in data sets, which I think does speak to my ability to kind of take in a peripheral observation set, whatever it might be, and spot things that are different. I also played center mid in soccer, which center mids are constantly like they are in some styles of soccer, right? They're the key kind of instigator of plays, right? They're sort of the on the field director because you typically need to have a wide sort of peripheral understanding of what's going on. So I think maybe I had some things I was just good at, like, and then I went into things that kind of supported those basic like ED analysis, without, because no one, I mean, I always liked math, I always liked science, but like why? It's because I think I was maybe good at them and I had an interest, but it's like what's that saying, did your, um, the chicken and the egg, right? Which came first, right? I don't know. So where I was going with that actually is like, so I started measuring HRV because I was not making the progress I used to make. And what I learned actually is my HRV was nominally fine, like all the time. So I'd be tanked, so freaking fatigued, right? Like just in the gutter, and my HRV is fine. And my heart rate was fine. Like in sessions, I just felt so fatigued. And so I want to just bring this up because there are situations potentially that, well, I think it's a benefit. At this point, I take it as a data point, and I actually use it to, and this is going to be against what you have said about listening to your body. I actually use it to override my fatigue. My feeling, and I have only N1 data to support this, but I'm seeing a lot with my athletes that are tracking HRV that also are in their 40s or 50s or 60s and have fatigue, that sometimes their HRV is low, right? And I do think that's fatigue. Like they didn't sleep well, and it usually tracks, right? Like if they're tracking with Aura, they got crappy sleep for 2 or 3 nights. They maybe didn't eat very well, or they were dehydrated, and so then it shows up in HRV. There are other times where they report feeling very tired, and their HRV is fine. And when they do attempt the session, if they can motivate to do it, their heart rate is fine and their power output is fine. My gut sense, and this is going to go against probably popular opinion, I'd love to know what your thoughts are, is like there are things that are happening in our sort of, well, it's, perimenopause aging. I don't know, because I work with more women than men, but I suspect that as the aging process happens, this level of fatigue is higher, and it's not always related to the actual fatigue from training or sleep. I mean, it is always related to sleep. And if you're sleeping like shit, then yes, like fatigue is related to that. So, this is probably not popular because from early on, we're taught to listen to our bodies, right? And like and some of us override it and some of us lie to ourselves about how ready we are to train hard because, yeah, no pain, no gain. And then we get to this stage in life, at least this is my experience, and I'm feeling this way and I'm going to doctors, right? I'm getting blood tests. There's nothing wrong. I did a sleep test. There's nothing wrong with my sleep. I suspect that it's hormonal imbalances, right? Like much lower testosterone, probably decreasing estrogen, but those are not enough. And my cortisol is fine, I will also say, because that's the catch-all that I see all the time. Practitioners telling athletes that they're overtraining and their cortisol is high. But guess what? They don't test their cortisol. They don't do even a single test. And to do cortisol testing, you need to do at least one 24-hour period test, right, without training involved to see if your baseline cortisol is high. And they never recommend these tests. So I'm like, well, that's bullshit. Show me the data. Show me the data that says your cortisol is high, because it's just become popularized to say, well, you're in that age, so your cortisol is high, and that's why you should stop training. I'm like, guess what? That's going to tank your HRV and your fitness and your health. And so you got to keep moving, but moving in a way that's more supportive of where you're at, which might be low, going for a walk instead of a run, TBD, depending on who you are. So, yeah, I just bring that up because it was curious. I was thinking for sure I'm going to see HRV issues, right? Like it's going to be really low or really high, and, it's going to be all messed up. And it's amazingly normal. So on that note, if you are going to measure HRV, you want to be really consistent about how you measure it. Because like Michelle said, hydration can affect it. If you have a full bladder, it can affect it. I have seen, and not to say my HRV doesn't move, it does. When I had COVID, I didn't need to have HRV tell me I was really sick, right? It absolutely tanked, right? But then last week, and I was mentioning this before Michelle and I started chatting, I measure my HRV in the mornings, and my resting heart rate was high and my HRV was very low, and for no reason. And then all of a sudden, and I was like, I don't understand what's going on. And then I kind of did my meditation and I'm like, oh yeah, my heart rate is kind of high. Within like 3 hours, I felt like utter shit. I mean, terrible headache, really upset stomach. My coffee didn't even taste good. So I either had a bug or I had some GI, minor food poisoning. And that showed me the HRV was low, and it totally tracked with then how I felt 3 hours later, which was curious. Alcohol definitely affects HRV. So and we see that in training, right? Like when people do dry months, their training is always better. So even if they're not drinking at what it would be a problem level from a cultural standpoint, alcohol suppresses your HRV, which is probably suppressing your ability to adapt from the training you're doing. I think that's pretty well proven, both in like the field data and the scientific data. So in the lab data. So yeah, where I was going with that is just you want to be really consistent. Use the same, like if you're going to use Aura, you're going to use, so Aura will measure your overnight HRV, which there's different implications, and maybe you know better than, or I can't really remember. It's tracking, that overnight HRV is more likely to pick up like if you ate late, if you had more alcohol, whereas taking your HRV on an app like HRV for training, which is free. Let me just check that.
It used to be $10 time,
Well, maybe you might be right. You might be right. I
which
don't
is
know.
ridiculously cheap. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's ridiculously cheap. It's not a subscription. You just pay one
Yeah,
time, and
right.
then you can use it
Yeah.
forever.
Right. And it uses the camera. It can pair with a Bluetooth heart rate, but always taking it in the same position. So if you're going to lay down, lay down. If you're going to sit up, sit up. And that way you can see, even though there's definitely differences in how you take the measurement, but over time, if you're doing it in as close to the same exact way every time, then you can see the trends in how you are adapting, recovering, if you're getting sick, if you're dehydrated, you had too much alcohol, which most of us don't need to mark that anymore. And I'm going to say it. Like, I think if you're a woman in this stage that's feeling a lot of fatigue all the time and there's literally no reason for it, and you've had blood work and you've checked your sleep, right? You've done a sleep test and you've checked your cortisol, and your training is like not anything out of the ordinary, right? I think using HRV to kind of help support yourself get out the door can be beneficial. I don't know. I describe it as, for me, like my fatigue level for most of my life was like at a certain level. And then when I hit like, 40, it's like up here. And there's literally no reason other than I think my hormones are probably tanking, right? So until they prove that, like, and there's no scientific evidence really, that, it's
We're not studying women anymore either, Mikki.
right.
So like, we'll
I know,
never
right? We
know.
can't, right? We can't. Although I did see, and I should pull this up. This is for another podcast, but I did see a study that actually refuted the long, not long term, but the a la Stacy Sims, that we should modify our training based on our cycle. They did a study of, I think it was, I want to say it's power lifters, though it was not endurance athletes, but that they had the same recovery, muscle soreness, adaptations. I think they even did some like some muscle testing to see how the muscle was synthesizing and repairing, and there was no difference over the cycle, none. So I think it was for lifters. I have to go back and check, but I thought that was interesting. And as usual, I think a lot of what gets put out is meant to be kind of like, how do I say this? Like it's philosophy based. Like there is some philosophical evidence around it. Like they base it on some real processes, but a lot of the testing does not prove it. I'm sorry. Like it just doesn't. And now, yes, we are not allowed to study women in this country. Maybe in New Zealand where Stacey, maybe she can run some more.
Maybe in
Yeah,
France, they'll do some studies on women and
they'll
we
do
can
some
learn
studies
from
that
them.
will, yeah,
Yeah. One thing I wanted to say, because you brought up a good point where you were like, I feel tired, but my HRV is fine. And so like, what do you do in that situation? And it's really important to keep in mind, like, what is HRV measuring? Like, HRV is measuring nervous system state. It is possible to be carrying a lot of physical fatigue that is different from nervous system dysregulation,
mm,
right?
yeah,
Like, it's like, and so being able to discern the difference between those, like, is it a nervous system state thing or am I just tired? And it's
right,
possible to just be tired and
yeah,
your nervous system state is fine. And in that case, there may be times when pushing through training. And I mean, this is to me like another reason to measure HRV because you're like thinking, should I train or should I not? And you take your HRV and it's in your normal zone and you're like, okay, so I'm just tired. So I'm just going to make sure that I'm doing all the things to support this training session today. Like I'm going to stay hydrated. I got my electrolytes. I have my carbohydrates. Like I'm going to use this as a time to be mentally tough because you're not dealing with a nervous system state that is going to prevent you from benefiting
right,
from that training. So that
right,
really is a thing. And it is possible to have like physiological fatigue that is not nervous system related. It's muscular. But yeah, HRV is not going to measure muscular soreness, muscular fatigue.
yeah, no,
That's why on
yeah,
that HRV for training, the questionnaire that it's asked afterward, are you muscularly sore? Right? Because
yep,
like HRV is not picking up on muscular activity
yeah,
like that. It's
right.
more central.
Yeah.
So
The
yeah.
one more little side note, you mentioned the PhD student. The only time I was the PhD student and I wasn't tracking my HRV, but yeah, the only time that I have had like severe night sweats was when I was finishing my dissertation. The only time. I've had some very mild night sweats as I've gotten into my 40s, but nothing like what in fact is actually a kind of a problem because when I go to my doctor and I'm like I think I'm having some perimenopausal symptoms and I'd like to get my hormones checked. And they're like, well, are you having night sweats? I'm like, no. And they're like, yeah, you're fine. Just come back when you don't have a period for a year. And I'm like, okay, because that's like the main thing that they go off of is like they start HRT if you're having night sweats, because that's apparently the only thing that women need to worry about, right? In terms of the aging process. Do you have night sweats or not? So absolutely, that was not from training. I've never had night sweats from training, but I was under extreme pressure to get this done and to do it very well. So yeah, I think my HRV, once I cut out alcohol, it's very consistent, except for when I get sick. Very few times when I'm really dehydrated. Other than that, it's like very, very simple, very stable.
And this is a really good thing. And we're gonna have to end on this point because I have a hard
Yeah.
stop today.
Oh, I know. Yeah, I'm sorry.
But an interesting thing. So Mikki says, your HRV is very consistent. Also, you live a really consistent life.
I do. I do.
Right? Like, so
Yeah.
and that is a thing. So, like, you've heard, I remember like Alan Couzens, at least, I mean, I used to be on Twitter when it was Twitter and when you could actually get like decent information off Twitter. I'm
Before it
no longer
became
on that
Nazi.
anymore. But Alan Couzens used to talk about that. And he used to like really piss a lot of people off. And everything he said was right, even if it was his tone was maybe not palatable to some people. But his whole point was like if you're interested in your own health, which you should be, right? That's you should be interested in your own health. And in order to be healthy, you want to live a low stress, healthy life that just like doesn't have a lot of other inputs from the world because it's like it's external inputs from the world and from other people and from other that tends to put us like on edge and in this stressed out state. And so when we can remove ourselves from a lot of that and go like live a simple life, that is going to just be healthier for our nervous systems. And then we can be in a stable HRV state. And when you're in a stable HRV state, the likelihood of you responding to training is higher. I remember Alan too at one point talking about like how good an easy bike ride is for HRV. So like, by the way, one of the things you want to do, like if you want to increase your HRV, then accumulating a lot of very low aerobic, like zone
Hmm.
one type stuff, work, walking, easy riding your bike, go do all those things. And I remember one time, like he said something about like, I read it on Twitter, like he's like, just go outside and ride your bike really easy, like on a bike path and just, super relaxed riding. Meanwhile, I'm out like riding on Oahu, and like you've been on Oahu,
Yeah.
maybe some of our like we live on an island.
Terrifying.
Like, all right, like even if I'm riding easy outside on Oahu, it is not relaxing for my nervous system because like I don't have really wide lanes with like smooth pavement and no cars around where I can just relax my nervous system. I'm thinking as I'm out there, even when I'm riding easy, like
You're
my
still on.
nervous system is on high alert because I'm trying to not die. I'm trying to not get hit by a car 100% of the time, always when I'm out there, and I guess to be fair, my eyes are darting around because I'm looking for cars that are about to pull out and hit me, and I'm screaming at cars. And like the amount of times that I yell out loud at cars every single ride, probably, I don't know, 6 or 8 times every single ride. And it's like, whether I'm riding hard or easy, outdoor rides here are a sympathetic
Yeah,
nervous system event.
absolutely.
Because it's like it is a fight or flight, legitimately trying to not die. So then it's like, all right, then, which is fine, as long as I know that's what I'm doing to myself. And I'm going to come home, I'm going to dedicate 5 minutes to like laying down on the ground with my feet up. I'm going to breathe slowly. I'm going to tell myself that I'm safe, everything is fine. I can go back into my calm state of relaxation, parasympathetic, rest and digest. Everything is good. And it is that awareness that Mikki and I are trying to really get across today. Like, be aware of your state. Are you in fight or flight? If you are, sometimes that's fine and appropriate. Bring yourself down as soon as you can.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, yeah, if you want to measure HRV, be consistent. There's some free apps and, know that there are differences. Well,
Yeah.
there's
How about this?
differences.
If you have
Yeah.
questions about that,
Yeah.
send Mikki or I a note and we will like super help you get started on how to measure HRV and all that.
Yeah. I have
Yeah.
a suggestion for our next one. I know you've got to go.
Yeah, go.
I recently had an athlete tell me, well, I just cut it because it's junk miles. And oh my God, my head
Junk
literally,
miles.
yeah, like let's talk about junk miles and how that
Let's
is
talk
a
about junk
total
miles.
bullshit. It's so frustrating that's still around that people still think there are junk miles because writing like Alan Cousins, who's brilliant, right? I have a big fan of Alan. His suggestions of like, go ride easy on the bike path. People, no pain, no gain, like that's junk, right? I mean, people literally, I know people personally who have won Ironmans based on what an Ironman build that was largely junk miles being zone one, zone two, having fun. You do enough of that, you get really fit.
Let's
So,
talk about
and you're
junk
probably
miles.
doing,
That's even going to be the title. Let's talk about junk miles.
yeah, we'll
Let's
do
do
that.
that. All right, cool.
Always a pleasure, Michelle. I look forward to talking to you next time.